Initiation into Hermetics by Franz Barden. Step 10. Magic Mental Training 10. Take a drink. Before the magician begins to follow the practice of the 10th, that is, the last step of this course, he may look back attentively and make sure if he achieved the positive realization of all he has been taught up to now. If that is not the case, he must try to make up for all he is still lacking and must go to any length for developing every faculty completely. Any kind of haste or hurry with respect to his development is useless and will work out awkwardly later in his magic task. To avoid disappointments, the magician is advised to take a sufficient amount of time and to work steadily but systematically. He must realize that this last step really represents the end of his magical development with respect to the first tarot card, and that he ought to be prepared for the higher magical tasks, which I am going to describe in the following two works, Practice of Magical Evocation and Key to the True Kabbalah. If there were gaps in his schooling, he would never be capable to control the higher powers. It is certainly not important whether he will finish his course a few months sooner or later. The main point will always be to keep his aim in mind and to advance steadily to the goal, the lofty heights of the God cognition. Looking back to his actual development, the magician will realize that he has already covered a good distance on the path of his perfection, even more than he had supposed to do. But he has to know that all this is only the thin end of a wedge. Meditating on the fact how much knowledge and experience he has still to store, he will bow in a spirit of great reverence in front of the divine fountain of wisdom. There will be no more pride or ambition nor superciliousness, to say nothing of bad qualities in his heart. For the deeper he penetrates into God's workshop, all the more humble and receptive will he become. The first task which the magician is facing in the 10th step is to win his way to the knowledge of the sphere of the elements. With his mental body, he will visit the different spheres of the elements, transfer himself to the kingdom of the gnomes or earth sprites, afterwards to the realm of the water nymphs. He gets to know the kingdom of the fairies and finally that of the salamanders, the so-called kingdom of the fire. To a non-magician, all this will be rubbish and he will regard it as an utopian idea. But for the true adept, neither fairy tales nor sagas do exist, because they are to be understood as a sort of symbolism concealing many a deep truth. It is the same thing with all the gnomes, water nymphs, fairies and salamanders. Based on his own observations, the magician can convince himself that beings like these do really exist. On the other hand, a magically absolutely untrained person whose senses are mentally thoroughly undeveloped is of course subject to the vibrations of the material world only and will never be able to form a mental picture of the existence of any other kind of beings. To say nothing of becoming convinced of this fact, most people are preoccupied by the material mode of life to such a degree that they will not understand anything higher and subtler outside our physical world, and, least of all, they will perceive it. It is quite otherwise with a magician who is developing his senses purposely and therefore will see and perceive far more convincing himself very soon of the existence of higher powers, planes, and beings. Drink. Properly speaking, it is the goal of our training to qualify the learner to perceive and to master not only the physical world, but the higher spheres equally. But let us not advance matters, but let us stick to the practice and consider what there can be done to reach the world of the elements. Ooh. In the previous chapters, we learned that there is a kingdom of elements populated not only by the element itself, but by the corresponding beings too. Then, which is the difference between a human being and an elemental being? The human being consists of 4 and 5 elements respectively and is ruled by them, whereas an elemental being is composed of the purest element to which it does belong. According to our estimation of time, the duration of life of such a being is probably longer, but in return it has no immortal spirit. As a rule, such a being is resolved into its element again. Let us disregard the description of details for a while, because the magician will learn everything by practical experiences. He will be able to do so by transference of his spirit. The magician is bound to understand how to transfer himself to the kingdom of the elements to contact the beings there. Later, he will even manage to rule over these beings. In my next work entitled Practice of Magical Evocation, I shall, in a particular chapter, treat the problem of summoning such beings to come to our material world. First of all, the magician has to realize that the kingdom of the elements has nothing to do with our material world, and that, consequently, he cannot transfer himself there without being previously qualified to do so. On the other hand, an elemental being can come to an understanding only with a congener. A fact which ought to be considered most carefully. A bird is well matched only with another bird. In the same way, an elemental being will have an understanding only with a congeneric being, i.e., a being of the same element. Provided it should like to come in contact with a human being, it would be bound to adopt a human shape and human qualities to approach man in form of man. At this point, the magician will realize why he did have to perform transmutation exercises in the previous steps. A gnome will never understand a human being, and so it will be the other way round. When operating this way, either the magician has to become a gnome, or else the gnome has to be transmuted in a human being. Consequently, wishing to enter the kingdom of the earth sprites, the magician will have to take the shape of a gnome. If he can't quite imagine what a gnome does look like, he must use his faculty of clairvoyance, whether in a trance, or try to see the shape of a gnome with the help of the magic mirror. He will notice that gnomes are very tiny sprites, similar to the brownies described in the fairy tales. Generally, they are portrayed as dwarfs with long beards and caps, with long hair, bright eyes, and garbed in little cowls. Such or similar will be the appearance of the gnome the magician will see in his magic mirror. He will also notice that every sprite is carrying a little lamp of different luminous force in order to find his way in the subterranean kingdom. If by means of his magic mirror the clairvoyant magician has convinced himself of the gnome's shape, he only has to mentally take the shape of a gnome. Moreover, he must identify himself with the earth element, i.e., load his whole shape with the earth element without any accumulation. Now the magician has to imagine nothing else but to sink down into the subterranean realm, viz. The earth. Suddenly, he will feel deep darkness surrounding him everywhere. His imagination forms a lamp illuminating the darkness with its bright light. At first, he will not discern very much, but repeating this experiment several times, his eyes will become accustomed to this dimness, so that he will discriminate beings in his own shape wishing to contact him. And after a lot of attempts, he will see the sprite folk more distinctly. He will even have the opportunity of seeing them diligent in their business, but be on your guard against speaking to them. Do not ask a question before any of the sprites has addressed you. It may happen that, in the course of the mutual work, the magician has watched something he might be tempted to criticize. He may be cautioned against doing so, for the earth sprites would overpower him instead of his bringing them under his control, which ought to be the purpose of this experiment. In such an occurrence, it might happen that by their various magical tricks, the gnomes could captivate him by means of the element, so that he would become a gnome himself, unable to return into his own body. Then, after a certain time, the mental bond between the astral and the physical body would break asunder, which would mean the physical death. A medical expert would, in such a case, find out death from heart attack, nothing more. But the magician, who, in the course of his magical training, has obtained the necessary self-control and considers this law, has nothing to fear. On the contrary, as soon as the gnomes begin to talk themselves, they see in him a being higher in rank and superior to them, and will try to make friends with him. This law, forbidding to address gnomes first, is only meant for the first visits. Later on, if the sprites are convinced of the magician's superiority in willpower and intelligence, they will enjoy it and become his most obedient servants. The earth sprites are nearest to man and like to serve him, especially if they recognize his superiority. Visits to the kingdom of the gnomes should be repeated as often as there is to be seen something new. He can learn a great deal from the gnomes, and not one book in the whole wide world can reveal so many secrets about the subterranean kingdom to him as he can hear in the world of the gnomes. For example, the magician can get a great deal of knowledge about the power and effect of different herbs. He can learn how to achieve a magical spell on certain stones. He can be informed about hidden treasures and other strange things. He will be witness of everything that happens and exists below the surface of the earth, such as springs, coal, minerals, etc. Besides, from the gnomes, the magician may learn several magic tricks which can be exploited through the earth element. In course of time, the magician will notice that there are different groups of intelligences among the earth sprites in the world of the gnomes. He will meet gnomes who are able to give him a lecture on alchemy. When at last the magician feels quite at home in the kingdom of gnomes, and when he made all the experiments which these beings were able to teach him, then he is allowed to visit the kingdom next to it, namely that of the water sprites or water nymphs. In the very same way, he may look for a water sprite in his magical mirror, and he will find that there exists a significant likeness to a human being. There is hardly any difference to be noticed, neither in shape nor in size. Usually the water sprites, called generally nixies, mermaids, or water nymphs, are very attractive females, although there are male water sprites, mermen too. As for visits to the kingdom of water, it is not absolutely necessary to adopt the shape of a woman. It is entirely up to the magician to transmute himself imaginatively into a mermaid. There is an advantage here. He will not be molested so much by the mermaids, because they are not only fascinating and dashingly beautiful, but also very abstruse and sexy. Providing the magician is mentally prepared so that he has impregnated his spirit with water, he may transfer himself to a big lake or to the ocean, wherever he likes to, and submerge down to the bottom of the water. Here as well, he will not at once meet the water sprites, but repeating the experiment many times and according to his vivid desire for communicating with these beings, he will finally attract them. At first, he will only see female beings moving about in the same free attitude as human beings do. So I lost my place there. He will hardly meet an unpleasant mermaid. In spite of the fact that all mermaids are very beautiful, he might indeed happen to meet the more intelligent ones, the so-called royal leaders, since here, likewise, a very peculiar class consciousness does exist. The magician will notice that they do not dance all the time as they are generally supposed to do, but that they do a certain amount of work too. It's no use to write more about this theme, the magician will convince himself of. Here as well goes the rule that nobody must ever address one of the mermaids first, but he has to wait until the being starts talking or asking him questions about something. From the intelligent leaders, the magician can learn such a lot about the water element that he could write books himself. He gets information about the life of fish, about the different water plants, the stones below the water, and about other magic tricks related with the water elements. But beware of the beauty of these beings. The magician may seriously be warned not to fall madly in love with a mermaid and not to lose his balance. A love like this could become fateful for him. That does not exactly mean that he is not allowed to have fun with the mermaids, but he must certainly keep the motto in mind, love being the law, but love under a strong will. A mermaid is quite capable to fascinate the magician with her incredible beauty, charm, and intoxicating erotism, so much that he is in serious danger of becoming one of the kind, a fact which would cause his physical death undoubtedly. How many magicians have been wrecked by an unhappy love? Therefore, the magician should remain firm, commanding his own passions, because it's this kingdom in the sphere of elements that is the most attractive one. And if the magician gave way to his passions, he would fall into the hands of the mermaids for good and all. As soon as the magician can manage to visit the kingdom of the water sprites as often as he likes to, and if he has learned whatever concerns the knowledge of magic, he can pay his attention to the kingdom next to it, the one of the aerial spirits. In contrast to the water kingdom, whose inhabitants, the mermaids or the nixies, like very much to communicate with human beings, the air sprites are very shy and unsociable. Similar to the water sprites, they have beautiful, dashing figures, and though male beings may be seen, most of them are females. Here the magician does not have to adopt a shape suitable for the air spirits. He can impregnate his own spirit with the air element and transfer himself imaginatively into the region of air, wishing for the air spirits to contact him. He ought not to lose patience if he does not succeed for a while, but he has to keep his mind constantly on his desire to see the air spirits at any price. He will notice at first that the beings avoid to meet him, a fact which is not to discourage him. Finally, he will see the most beautiful beings with a gorgeous etheric body, soft and supple. The magician must mentally imitate the air spirits by moving about, as it were floating, carried by the air. Not long from now, the air spirits will address him. Here, likewise, the magician be cautioned against addressing any of the beings first, lest the same ill fate should befall him as described previously. If, after repeated experiments, the contact with the air sprites has been established, the magician will be informed by them about whatever concerns the air element. He will be taught many magical secrets and practices which no man living would have the least inkling of. Being fully acquainted with the air element and its beings, and mastering the magic technique, the magician may proceed to the spirits of the fire element, which he will have to contact now. These beings have a certain likeness to human beings, but they are rather odd in some ways, and it is therefore advisable for the magician to get an impression of these beings with the help of a magic mirror. He will notice that the fire spirits have a much smaller face than men, and an extraordinarily long and thin neck. He will therefore transfer himself imaginatively into the shape of a fire sprite, loading it with the pure fire element, and off he goes to the spirit's sphere, into a crater or a volcano, the most remarkable homestead of the fire spirits. From what we stated before, the magician will have noticed that the beings of the air are restless and moving about constantly. All the same may be applied to the fire sprites, which everywhere are roaming, as nervous and fidgety as the element they belong to. The magician ought not to forget the rule of not talking first to any of the beings. Here there are likewise different groups of intelligences, and the highbrows among these fire spirits are those whose outer appearance is more beautiful. The highest ranks of these organisms are the most similar to man, and it is obvious that the magician will try to come into contact with the most intelligent of them. As for the practice of magic, he will learn a great deal about what can be accomplished with the fire element. If the magician is now sufficiently acquainted with the fire spirits and their leaders in the craters, so that they taught him all he wanted to know, he may be allowed to visit those of the fire organisms who, living in the deepest center of the earth, have a profounder knowledge. Not before having exhausted all possible sources of information about the fire element, he may, with a good conscience, regard himself sovereign of all the elements. There is one conviction which the magician will win while visiting all the element organisms, namely, however great the intelligence and knowledge of these sprites may be, they are still composed of one single element, whereas man represents all four elements and moreover the fifth, viz. The principle of God. Now he will understand why the Bible says that man is the most perfect of all beings created by God in his own image. This is the reason of the discontent of all the elemental organisms at the sight of man's immortality, toward which all of them feel envy. It is understandable that each elemental being seeks to obtain immortality, and a magician is in a position to bestow such an opportunity on them. Unfortunately, it is not possible for the time being to particularize how all this is brought about but it can be taken for granted that the magician will by now intuitively find out all by himself. It is obvious that the magician will transfer all the experiences made through his contact with other creatures into his memory, that is, into the physical body, and he will also be able to use these experiences, changed into practice on the material plane as well. A magician like this will be able, in the magic of nature, to execute the most astounding performances under the nose of a layman. After the magician's further progress is profoundly knowing and practically controlling the 4 elemental kingdoms, he may try to come into contact with his spiritual teacher, his guru or genius. As mentioned previously, with respect to the passive communication with the world beyond, man was given by the divine providence a guardian angel or genius directing his mental development and watching over it. Here, for the first time, man came into passive contact with his genius. But thanks to his clairvoyance, he could see his genius either when in trance or in his magic mirror, if he wished to contact him. But now he has advanced as far as to establish a visible connection with his genius on the mental plane. The practical performance is not difficult, provided the genius did not make himself known already formally to a magician mastering the mental wandering perfectly. The practice of the visible connection with the genius needs only one thing, that is, to stand upright and to feel imaginatively grasped and carried off with a whirling motion in the air. Instead of being whirled into the air, one can imagine oneself the other way round, too, that is, being as light as a feather and being pushed off the earth. This is left to the concentration of every individual. After several attempts, the magician will find out by himself which method is best suitable for him. If, thus, the magician is ascending mentally, he is climbing higher and higher until the earth looks like a small star, and, while being completely removed from the globe and floating in the universe, he concentrates on the wish that his guide might appear before him, or he might be drawn towards the guide. If not instantly, certainly after some trials, the guide or guardian angel or whatever you may call him will become visible to the magician. The first meeting with his spiritual leader will make a deep impression on the magician, since, henceforth, he has the opportunity of mutual intercourse from mouth to mouth, from ear to ear. First of all, he will ask his genius when, how, and under which conditions he can contact him at any time. Every scholar then has, of course, to obey the instructions of the leader. From now, the guru is taking over the magician's guidance. As soon as the connection with the guru has been established, the magician will enter the last phase of his mental development, and as the physical world has nothing more to offer and to say to him, he will visit other spheres. He will manage this in the same manner by ascending straight as a dart from the earth, concentrating on the sphere he wishes to visit, and according to his will, being attracted by the sphere. As there does not exist any perception of time and space for his spirit, he can visit any sphere instantly, either alone or in company of his leader. According to the Kabbalistic tree of life, he will reach in turns, first the sphere of the moon, next the one of Mercury, then that of Venus, of the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and finally the sphere of Saturn. On all spheres he will meet the organisms living there, and he will learn to know all about their laws and secrets. If the magician has gone so far as to, I think that should be B, he, let's start that sentence again. If the magician has gone so far as to be able to visit the universe, that is, the spheric planetary system of the organisms, and to master it, his mental training is completed. He has grown to be a perfect magician. He is a brother of the light, a true adept, who has achieved a great deal, but not yet all.